Lying in the magnificent blue waters between the South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca, 137 kilometers north of the equator, the island state of Singapore enjoys a reputation of being a garden city. Thanks to a strategic location and a hard-working, persevering and resourceful people, Singapore was transformed from a fishing village into a major international port in less than 2 centuries. Today, Singapore is the hub of industrial development, trade, finance, communications and tourism in Southeast Asia. Modern Singapore is founded on the sweat and tears of our ancestors. We should not forget their contributions and their sacrifices. Even as we enjoy the fruits of their labor, let us trace their footsteps to remind ourselves of the trials and tribulations our forefathers went through to lay a strong foundation for Singapore. According to the ancient Chinese historical records, Chinese settlers were found in Singapore during the Yuan dynasty, about 470 years before Sir Stamford Raffles' arrival. Singapore, which was then known as Longyamen or Temasek, had established trade links with Quanzhou in southern China. In those early days, Singapore was dominated by jungles and swamps. Roving the island were tigers and poisonous snakes. The early immigrants who stayed settled on both sides of the Singapore River. Modern Singapore was founded by Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819. An influx of settlers led him to design a plan for the town 4 years later. Under the scheme, the Chinese community was settled according to their dialect groups. For example, the people from Fujian settled mainly in the Tolokai area. The Chaozhou immigrants concentrated in Boat Quay and at the foot of Fort Canning. The Chinese from Guangdong congregated in Kreta Ayer, while the Hainanese lived in the Beach Road and Middle Road areas. Business activities of the early immigrants also tended to be based on dialect groupings. The migrants from Fujian and Chaozhou were mainly engaged in the import-export business, finance and shipping. The people of Guangdong and Sanjiang became tailors, furniture makers or jewelers. Hainanese ran coffee shops, while the Kejia operated Chinese medicine and pawn shops. The Fuqing and Xinhua groups dominated the transport and communication trades. Singapore became a busy port of call for ships sailing between Europe and Asia and between Australia and the Malay archipelago. Soon after its founding, the Singapore harbour was being frequented by cargo-laden ships. Warehouses began to spring up by the sides of the Singapore River, and it was in these warehouses that many of our early immigrants sweated it out as coolie labourers. This is one of the coolie quarters in Pagoda Street. It was built 100 years ago. Ventilation was poor as there was no window in the cubicle. All the belongings of the coolie occupants were crammed into this little space. This was where the coolies rested their tired bodies after a hard day's work. They would lie in the cubicle and pass their lonely nights, yearning for their loved ones back in their homeland. Many of the early immigrants were either abducted as or conned into indentured laborers. The indentured laborers were often required to work for their employers without salaries for a year to repay the expenses incurred for their voyage. Some unscrupulous employers even lured their coolies into vices such as opium smoking, gambling, and visiting the whorehouses so as to extend their employment. Those who tried to stay clear of the vices were subjected to threats of losing their livelihood. In spite of the prospects of such a tough life, why did our forefathers risk their lives to come to such a far-flung place as Singapore? Between the 1860s and 1870s, the demand for labor rose as a result of the rapid expansion of trade here. An increasingly large number of Chinese laborers were sold to Singapore. In China, particularly in the coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, poverty and wars drove many people out of their homeland to Nanyang, the South Seas, to earn a living. Let's listen to the recollections of an early immigrant.
In those days, there were many warlords fighting in China. They recruited people by force to help them carry goods. Few recruits returned alive. Everybody was running away from the warlords who would catch hold of women or even old people when they failed to get younger males to join them.
Our forefathers crammed themselves into Chinese junks that took them through an uncertain sea voyage lasting 2 to 3 weeks. On arrival, they had to be quarantined at St. John's Island for 2 to 3 days before they were allowed to proceed to the main island. Here is a relic of the quarantine station on St. John's Island. An immigrant talks about his experience.
The immigrants from China had to walk through a building with showers. The showers contained a kind of antiseptic. We were all drenched.
As newcomers to Singapore, the coolies had to turn to their relatives and fellow villagers for help to earn a living. Such assistance made a difference between life and death. One Fujian ballad sung by the early immigrants had this sad line:
"You can afford to eat fish if you have relatives. If not, you have no choice but to swallow your tears."
Like soldiers who went to the war front, our forefathers risked their lives to come to this part of the world with no certainty of being able to return home safe and sound. Some lucky ones made their fortunes and rose to be local community leaders. The rich would then return to China and become respectable men in their homeland. However, they were the minority. Most of the laborers lived from hand to mouth and could only dream of returning home. When they died, they were buried in the foreign land. The building of the Hin Shanting Temple in Zilat Road was to settle their problems after death. The Hin Shanting Temple, built in 1828, is the oldest existing Chinese temple in Singapore. Its founder, Si Hu Ke, was a pioneer of the Fujian community in Singapore. The term Heng Shang referred to the cemetery located in the area near today's Kampong Baru. The temple was set up for ancestral worship and funeral arrangements of the people from Zhangzhou and Quanzhou counties of Fujian province. It developed into a Fujian community setup where major affairs affecting the community were discussed. As the population grew and the trades expanded, social problems became more complex. The Heng Shanting Temple, which was set up primarily as a place for ancestral worship, became inadequate to cope with the demands of the time. At the same time, as more and more Chinese immigrants settled in Singapore, they needed another temple. So the Tian Hock Keng was built in the densely populated Telok Ai Street. Inscriptions on the stone tablets erected in the temple showed that the temple was built between 1839 and 1842, costing 30,000 Spanish dollars. It was a princely sum then. The magnificent temple is still well preserved today. The Tian Hock Keng Temple was originally built next to the sea. However, because of land reclamation, the temple is no longer near the shore today. The shrine for Tian Hao, or Ma Tu, goddess of the sea, occupies the main altar in the central portion of the temple. The goddess of the sea is believed to be the protector of those who navigate the sea. She was particularly important as Chinese immigrants sailed to Singapore in primitive Chinese junks of the 19th century. Before their voyage, they would go to the temple of the goddess of the sea to pray for their safety. The different dialect groups here built their own temples. For example, the Guangdong people built Fu Tak Chi, the Chao Chou, Wak Hai Cheng Bio, the Kechia, Hu Tek Su, and the Hainanese, the Tin Hao Gong. As the Fujians were the most influential dialect group in terms of human and financial resources, the Tian Hock Keng Temple became the supreme organization of the 19th century Chinese community in Singapore. The Chao's Association, set up around 1819, was the earliest clan association in Singapore. It was a place of worship for immigrants from Taishan in Guangdong province. Other kinship-related clan associations include Lin's clan, built in 1857, Charles clan, built in 1860, Po Chiak Kung Tan's clan, built in 1878, and Phu's clan temples, built in 1887. People from the same province, prefecture, district, county, or people who bore the same surname formed their own associations. The association was their meeting place. Members rallied around their association. The association looked after almost all the needs of a member. It provided medical care, solemnized members' marriages, arranged their funerals, settled disputes, maintained law and order, built hospitals, schools, and other facilities. The public spiritedness of the Chinese pioneers was exemplary for their future generations. A good example was Tan Tok Seng, chairman of the management committee of Tien Hock King Temple in Tilok Aye and founder of the Tan Tok Seng Hospital. The hospital still stands at Mulmain Road today, serving people of all races. The Tong Chai Medical Institution was founded and managed by people from various dialect groups in 1885. It showed that early community leaders were able to pool their resources for a good cause, regardless of their dialect origins. For more than 100 years, both Tan Tok Seng Hospital and the Tong Chai Medical Hall have served the community well. Their contributions to health services are invaluable to the people. In early Singapore, there were no piped water supplies in the city. People obtained their supply from peddlers who sold water on bullock carts. Hence the street name Kreta Aye, which means water carts in Malay. During the dry spell, life became uncomfortable with an inadequate water supply. In view of this, Tan Kim Seng donated $13,000 in November 1857 to the government to pipe water from the MacRitchie Reservoir to the city. Although this scheme did not materialize in his lifetime, the government later erected a fountain to commemorate his contribution. The fountain stands at Elizabeth Walk. He also financed the construction of Kim Seng Road and Kim Seng Bridge. Chiang Hong Lim was another immigrant noted for his philanthropy. In 1887, he built the Yi Huang Dian, a temple in Havelock Road, at his own expense. He also rebuilt Ching Nan Temple in Nasser Street. Chiang supported the government's action against gangsterism by erecting a stone tablet with inscriptions warning against gambling, opium smoking, and other illegal activities in the temple. He donated a piece of land to be developed as a park for public recreation. It is now known as Hong Lim Park. For the convenience of residents, Chiang built a market named after him in Kim Seng Road. His most unique contribution was to organize a fire brigade, Yan Sheng Fire Brigade, to augment the government's firefighting force. The early immigrants were the poor and jobless in their homeland. They had little or no education. Deprived of education themselves, they attached great importance to their children's education. They built and ran schools with their own funds. Their contributions laid the foundation for the many achievements of Singapore today. The earliest Chinese school, known as Chong Wen Pavilion, was founded in 1849 and was housed in an annex building of the Tien Hock King Temple in Telokai Street. 5 years later, the Chui Ying School was set up in nearby Amoy Street. These two schools, modeled after the private tuition classes in China, were the forerunners of Chinese education in Singapore. In 1905, a new type of school emerged. Set up by Ying Fo Fui Kun, Kecha Clan Association, the Ying Sin School taught English and mathematics in addition to Chinese. More new schools like Tao Nan, Ai Tong, and Chong Hock Girls were set up soon after. Many schools were built during that period. They included the Kifat School by the Kerchas Cha Yong Association, Yokeng High School by Qing Chao Hui Kwan, Hainanese Clan Association, Yung Ching School by the Guangdong people, and Tuan Mong School by Nian Company. In 1918, the Chinese High School, the first Chinese secondary school in Singapore, was founded with the combined efforts and resources of the various dialect groups. By 1955, the first ever Chinese institution of higher learning in Southeast Asia, Nanyang University, was born. People from all walks of life, trishaw riders, taxi drivers, workers, businessmen, donated money or took part in donation drives to raise funds for the university. Nanta, as it was popularly known, signified the climax of the drive for education by the Chinese community. The growing influence of the Chinese community attracted the attention of the authorities concerned. China set up its consulate in Singapore in 1877. In the same year, the British colonial government established the Chinese Protectorate to handle Chinese affairs. The present Ministry of Labour building at Havelock Road was a former office of the Chinese Protectorate. In 1881, the Qing government of China sent a career diplomat, Chuo Pinglung, as its consul to deal with the Chinese Protectorate official in Singapore. The first Chinese-language daily newspaper in Southeast Asia, Lat Pao, was also launched in 1881 in Singapore. From then on, the Chinese community in Singapore leaned increasingly towards China. This explained why, before the Second World War, the majority of the Chinese regarded themselves as overseas Chinese and were concerned with political developments in China. For example, they supported Dr. Sun Yat-sen's drive against the Manchu government. The Sun Yat-sen villa in Tai Jin Road was actually his revolutionary base in Singapore. It was a popular practice for the Chinese to remit money to their families in China. They did so through local Chinese remittance houses. On February 15, 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese and was renamed as Saunan Island. Singaporeans suffered much hardship during the 3 years and 8 months of Japanese occupation. During this period, The Chinese engaged in wars against the Japanese aggression in China as well as in Singapore and Malaysia. Local Chinese, under the leadership of Tan Kah Kee, rallied behind the Federation of China relief funds in aid of the compatriots in China. The Yi Ho Hien Club in Bukit Pasoh was a former office of the Federation. Chinese clan associations have played different roles at different times in the past. The Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce, formed in 1906, soon replaced the Tien Hock Keng Temple as the supreme organization of the Chinese community. With the support of the various clan associations, the Chamber raised funds for flood and fire victims in Kampong Bugis in 1951, flood victims in Potong Pasir, Lorong Tai Seng, Geylang Serai, Bedok in 1954, and fire victims at Bukit Ho Swee in 1961. As nationalism mounted during the post-war period, overseas Chinese began to show interest in local politics and citizenship. In 1955, the Chamber launched a campaign to persuade voters to go to the polls. The Chamber also petitioned the government to lift the language restrictions in the Legislative Council elections. The Chamber and the various clan associations successfully pressed for the passing of the Citizenship Ordinance in 1957. Thereafter, it encouraged Chinese residents to register themselves as citizens. When Singapore became a self-governing state in 1959, the Chamber organized the Singapore Constitution exhibition at the Old Kallang Airport as a form of celebration. During the period of Indonesian confrontation following Singapore's merger with Malaysia in 1963, the Chamber and the various clan associations rallied behind the government in defense of the sovereignty of the country. When Singapore became independent on the 9th of August 1965, it was an urgency to build up its own defense force. The Chamber took the lead in raising money from all associations in Singapore for the Defence Fund. With the passage of time, clan associations in Singapore obviously had to redefine their traditional roles. On the 20th of December 1984, a seminar was convened to chart a new course for the clan associations. Clan associations are now organizing cultural activities on a bigger scale. Some are opening their doors to different dialect groups and welcoming them to take part in the association activities. On the 27th of January 1986, the Singapore Federation of Chinese Clan Associations was inaugurated by the second Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Ong Teng Cheong. Led by the Federation, the various clan associations are ready to play a new role in the social development of Singapore.